Hi, my name is Matt Bernhard, and I'm going to be talking to you about the revolution in Egypt, including the overthrow of President Mubarak and all the events that have led up to Egypt's first parliamentary elections since the outing of the president. In my research, I compared 5 articles. 5 of the articles are from the New York Times, and the other 5 are from Al Jazeera. While comparing the articles, I consider these 7 questions. What is and what started the revolution in Egypt? How does the coverage in the United States differ from the coverage in the Middle East? How much space/importance is given to Egypt compared to the other area? What are the main issues being portrayed? Who is being represented? What is missing in the coverage? And whether or not the coverage is balanced or biased. Before I give my analysis of the articles, I first want to give some background information on what exactly is going on in Egypt and talk about what sparked the revolution. The Egyptian Revolution began on Tuesday, January 25, 2011. The revolution has been mainly a campaign of nonviolent civil resistance that has included demonstrations, marches, acts of civil disobedience, and labor strikes. The main focus of the Egyptian protesters is placed on legal and political issues, including police brutality, state of emergency laws, lack of free elections and freedom of speech, uncontrollable corruption, and economic issues including high unemployment, food price inflation, and low minimum wages. The most famous protests have taken place in Tahrir Square in Cairo, but other uprisings have also taken place in Alexandria, other parts of Cairo, and other cities in Egypt. Despite being predominantly peaceful in nature, the revolution was not without violent clashes between security forces and protesters, with at least 846 people killed and 6,000 injured. Throughout the protest, many have demanded the overthrow of the Egyptian president, Hosni Mubarak, and due to the amount of protest and pressure, Mubarak finally resigned from office on February 11, 2011. Currently, the country of Egypt is under military control, and the country's head of the state is incumbent Mohammed Hussein Tantawi, who is also the chairman of the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces. Military rule is definitely not favored by the people, and the protesters have made this known. On November 19, 2011, many protesters began to call for Egypt's military to hand over power. These protesters were then attacked by security forces. This attack left many injured, and 22 protesters were killed. Although there have been a large amount of protesters that have been injured or killed in demonstrations, a representative of the Egyptian army was quoted saying that the army recognizes the protesters' right to freedom of expression and will not use force against peaceful demonstrators. Unfortunately, there have been many times in which the peaceful protests have turned deadly. According to an article in Al Jazeera from September 10, 2011, the protests at Israel's embassy in Cairo escalated into an attack on the facility. This attack brought down the Israeli flag and forced the ambassador and his staff to flee in the middle of the night. These protesters at the embassy were started because 3 weeks prior to the incident, 4 Egyptian security officers were killed by Israelis. This angered the Egyptians and humiliated the country's military council. It also later, as we all know, resulted in an attack on the embassy. The political situation in Egypt is going through change, and freedom of press is something that is respected, as long as it is done peacefully and without harm to others. It was previously stated that the citizens of Egypt wanted Mubarak to be overthrown. The protesters got what they wished for when Mubarak finally resigned. After the resignation of President Mubarak, the revolution seemed to have lost steam and slowed down. Some even thought that the revolution was dead. This was the case until July 8, 2011, when protesters again began to flood Tahrir Square, located in downtown Cairo. The New York Times states that the thousands of people returned to Tahrir Square to voice frustration with what they called the slow pace of change 5 months after the revolution. This lack of change sparked what some called the New Revolution. In an article from Al Jazeera, an Egyptian protester was asked what he thought about the New Revolution. He claimed that the revolution was never dead, and the revolution will go on until all the people's demands are met. There are differences in the ways that Al Jazeera and the New York Times portray the new revolution. In my opinion, when you compare the New York Times article to the one from Al Jazeera, it seems to me that the writer of the New York Times article does not feel the citizens' hunger for justice and equality as much as the writer from Al Jazeera does. I believe this because the New York Times article uses very simple words and not as many quotes as the Al Jazeera article. The article from Al Jazeera uses quotes that also seem more passionate. For example, one man is quoted as saying, "We are going to Tahrir because none of the main demands have been met, which are freedom, social justice, and equality." When I hear a quote like that, I feel like I am part of the revolution, and it really gets me into the article. Some might say that the Al Jazeera is showing more bias towards the protesters with quotes like that, but I believe that they are delivering the necessary information. Many people were killed and injured by government officers during the beginning of the revolution when protesters were trying to overthrow President Mubarak. Mubarak's lack of control of the officers that hurt and killed many of the protesters landed the president in hot water. President Mubarak was charged of corruption and complicity in the killing of protesters. Mubarak's trial began on August 3, 2011, and to no one's surprise, he, quote, categorically denied all the charges. The charges he faced included premeditated murder, the killing of protesters, the failure to use his power to stop abuses against civilians, and collusion with other individuals in the misuse of state funds. The trial did not finish and was pushed back to a later date. Outside of the courthouse, there were Mubarak supporters and people completely against the former president. Of course, the two sides clashed. The New York Times stated that they threw rocks at each other. The article also stated that both sides would chant for whatever side they supported. Some chanted, "We love you, Mubarak," while others chanted, "Raise your voice, freedom will not die." Overall, I feel that both articles were very similar, but there was one small difference between them. While the Al Jazeera article just presented the bare facts, the New York Times article showed a little bias against the former Egyptian ruler and all Middle Eastern rulers. The article said things like, the trial of the president was offering an indelible lesson for Egypt and the Arab world in the humbling of power. The New York Times article did have more quotes than before and offered more insight from Egyptian civilians, but the small use of bias was very apparent. After the resignation of Mubarak, the Egyptian military took control of the government. On November 18, 2011, Egyptian Islamists made everyone aware that they were unhappy with the way that the military was controlling the government. The article from the New York Times stated that tens of thousands of Islamists jammed Tahrir Square, demanding the swift exit of Egypt's interim military rulers. Much of the anger was due to the military council spelling out its intentions to preserve a decisive role for itself in Egyptian politics. This angered the Islamists. One man was quoted in the New York Times saying that the people didn't sacrifice hundreds of lives in the revolution so that military would jump all over their will. The man also asked, if they can do this, what is the point of parliamentary elections? The article also stated that the rally represented the beginning of a new battle between Egypt's two most powerful political forces, the military and the once outlawed Muslim Brotherhood. During the protests, many expressed their displeasure with the military rule and Field Marshal Mohammed Hussein Tantawi, the man that heads the council, by chanting, "Tantawi, we will step over you with a shoe." Others simply chanted, "Down with the rule of the military." The article in Al Jazeera expressed that, after those protests, the government was concerned about the parliamentary elections that were to be held later in the month. The government even had a plan to possibly postpone the elections. These articles presented in Al Jazeera and the New York Times included a lot of insight from people involved in the protests, some on the protester side and some on the government side. There was a slight difference, however, in the Al Jazeera article, in that it presented a lot more of the violence and clashing that continues to go on between the protesters and government forces. Overall, I believe that both articles presented the necessary information for all the audiences in a clear, unbiased fashion. After reading the articles from the New York Times and Al Jazeera regarding the revolution in Egypt, I developed a few discussion questions. The first one is, now that the parliamentary elections have taken place, How long will it take before Egypt has a stable government again? Another question that can be discussed is, there was some dissent showed towards Israel by some protesters with the attacks on the embassy. Will this affect the relationship between Egypt and Israel in the future? There is no doubt that Egypt will become stable again, but as stated before, this will take time and patience from the citizens to achieve this goal.